So in this showcase, we're going to see how you can build really powerful pattern of life analysis applications with our geospatial SDK MapWeave and our timeline SDK KronoGraph. So before we sort of dive into the details, I'll just give you a very quick orientation of what you're seeing here on the screen. So in the background here, we've got our MapWeave application. We've got a sort of Mapbox base map loaded in, and we've loaded in nearly 1.5 million observations of taxis, in this case, moving around the Porto area. So this is a small sample of the well-known open source Taxi Porto's pattern of life data set. That data set tracks several hundred taxis over the course of a year. We've just focused on the 30 busiest taxis across about a 2-month period. And that's what you're seeing here on the map. Now, on the left-hand side, we've got our KronoGraph timeline. And here you can see every one of the individual taxis, our entities. And for each one, you've got a timeline of their events. Now, at this level, KronoGraph automatically aggregates all this data up to a heat map, which in itself can be sort of very useful, as we'll sort of discuss, for sort of spotting patterns and outliers. But you can also zoom directly in, to this map and sort of resolve the individual journeys. So in this particular case, on the timeline, rather than sort of seeing every single individual observation, we've sort of taken the start and end observations of each taxi journey and created these duration events on our timeline. And it equates to sort of over 30,000 sort of taxi events, which correspond to those 1.5 or so million observations. So that's the quick orientation. So let's now sort of have a look at this data set from the perspective of a pretend analyst. And this analyst may be coming at this from along a number of different vectors. So the first and perhaps the sort of the simplest one is, coming at a pattern of life data set, as an analyst, I might already know particular entities of interest. And I just really quickly want to be able to filter the data set down to those specific entities that I'm interested in, and then investigate their movements, their patterns of life. KronoGraph makes that really easy. It comes with its own native controls. You don't have to build any other sort of JavaScript or CSS sort of components here. We've got these focus and pin controls on every entity as we sort of hover over them. So when we click focus, in our implementation, we sort of filter out all the other entities. We kind of collapse the timeline to just show the taxi that we focused on. And on the right-hand side, we've also filtered out all the observations apart from the taxi that was focused. And as we focus the taxi, and this will be the same for the pin, rather than now showing the individual observations, we show a sort of automatically calculated trajectory for all these different journeys. And again, this is something MapWeave does for free for us. Sort of calculates these trajectories through the observations. And you've even got sort of options to kind of say to it, what's the sort of maximum gap between observations that sort of constitute, being part of the same journey. But what if I want to sort of overlay a number of taxis of interest over the rest of the data and not hide everything? So that's where we sort of used our pin control. So now I'm going to sort of pin these 3 random taxis here, and you see their trajectories are being overlaid over the rest of the data on the map. We're keeping everything in context on both the timeline and the map, although we've sort of modified the coloring to kind of mute the other observations and journeys a bit, and sort of really sort of bring our selected taxi journeys to the fore. And here we can clearly see those taxi journeys again, and as we sort of move along the timeline, their sort of trajectories will be nicely updating, and we can investigate the patterns of life of multiple entities at the same time. So that's if I know who I'm looking for. What if I don't know that? What if instead what I know are a number of areas of interest, target areas of interest within my sort of operating environment? Let's take a look, for example, at the airport area, and let's zoom in here on the timeline. Let's go sort of early hours of the morning, July the 30th. So we've got just a few hours of time, quite a lot of activity here, taxis sort of picking people up, dropping off. And I've got this, we've we've added this control which lets me sort of drag out a polygon, in this particular case a rectangle, and sort of filter just that area. So while these controls are sort of custom to our sort of demonstration, what it's using under the hood is MapWeave's GeoJSON layer. And we've created here this polygon, which has filtered the data down on the map to just the taxis who had observations within that polygon, and importantly, within the time frame that we had selected on our timeline. And that's now marked out using this marker feature on the chronograph timeline, which we can see here. And we can see that instantly that's filtered this, lots of taxis down to just two that were observed there within that time frame. Excellent. And of course, I can kind of go and do this multiple times. Maybe I'm interested in sort of knowing, were either of those taxis then observed on the subsequent day in sort of the early morning by the train station in Porto? So now I'm going to go and draw another polygon over here. And lo and behold, one of those taxis was, right? So in a really quick space and time, I was able to sort of draw out multiple polygons, sort of filter, 1.5 million observations down, to just one single taxi that was sort of observed in both areas. Really powerful capability. So that's if I had some target areas of interest in mind. What if I don't have either? What if I'm coming at this, looking for patterns and perhaps even more importantly, looking for some outliers, something that will jump out at me, and then I'm going to kind of investigate that further. So here again, Chronograph really comes into its own. And the way it does it is with this really powerful feature called scale wrapping. So rather than looking at time sort of flowing in the sort of traditional from yesterday through to tomorrow, right, sort of normal kind of linear time scale, Chronograph gives you the ability to wrap those same events around a repeating unit of time. And you see up here, we've kind of built a couple of controls that lets us scale wrap by the day or week. So I'm going to select scale wrapping by week, and that's sort of taken my 1.5 million observations. And now, rather than sort of laying them out on this linear timeline, it's kind of laying them out, based on, which day of the week and what time did they take place, right? Immediately, a couple of things jump out at me. I can see this taxi's had a couple of breaks where they've, they don't seem to work at particular sort of days and hours. And this taxi, 3 or 4, is interesting because they appear to be the only one that doesn't normally work on a Sunday during the daytime. However, if I start to sort of zoom in on that, I notice that actually they've had this one journey, just this one time. It would have been sort of perfectly normal for one of the taxis to not work on a Sunday. But the fact that they had this one journey, that one time, that's interesting. That's a very interesting outlier. So now I've got them pinned. I'm going to go back to my sort of standard time scale. And now I'm going to go and investigate this taxi's journeys and see what else that they've been up to. And this is, again, where our sort of now line, our marker here, comes really in handy, as this does the tracker nodes feature. So, I'm scrolling around here on the timeline, and one of the things that I can do is I can have a look at and see, okay, so when this now line intersects, a particular taxi journey, I can see, exactly where that sort of taxi was, during that journey. This is something, again, that MapWeave can kind of automatically do for me. And we can, we can create these tracker nodes, which sort of lets us kind of control the timeline either way. I can either drag the tracker or I can drag the timeline, so move the tracker. But the other thing I can do is I've got this now line here, so I can sort of see what other taxis have had sort of intersecting journeys kind of at the same time. And this way, perhaps observe some convoying behavior. Now, that's not necessarily very interesting for taxis, right? But if this was, say, a data set of mobile devices, right, of vessels, AI, based on AIS sort of signals moving out at sea, right? This could be really interesting because, I could sort of observe some ship-to-ship, transfers going on here, or maybe some sort of mobile devices that, shouldn't necessarily be meeting, but are in fact having a meeting somewhere, in a park in the city. So I'll start toggling on these various sort of taxis that have intersecting journeys, see, were they convoying together? So this one, no, this one's sort of some way out somewhere else. We've got another one here. Closer, but doesn't appear to be sort of traveling to totally different sides of the city at the same time. What about this one down here? Okay. So these ones are quite close together, and they appear potentially to have sort of had a very similar journey. So I'm going to zoom in closer so I just see those two journeys for the taxis on the timeline. And look at that. They really appear to be convoying here. So let me just sort of take this to the start. So we can see that our purple taxi here sort of starts out right here in the heart of Porto. And in fact, the green one starts just a sort of block or two down, just, a minute or so later, and starts following the purple taxi. Now they're quite far from each other. But if we sort of, drag time forward a bit, by this point, the green taxi starts to overtake the purple one. And then look at that. They sort of end their journeys, in exactly the same place. And this isn't the airport. This isn't, some sort of central hotel or something like that. This is 3 a.m. in the morning, going from the same sort of point in the city center out to near the sort of the port area. Interesting? Maybe. Hopefully you've seen that, no matter the sort of the vector by which, as an analyst, you're kind of approaching a sort of a large pattern of life data set, the combination of MapWeave and KronoGraph is a really powerful one for building applications that can scale to the needs of these kind of users. Whether it is, being able to really quickly filter on specific entities in massive data sets, whether it is, being able to sort of draw out polygons on a map to, to just filter on entities which have been observed within those areas, or whether, they need a helping hand to sort of detect both patterns as well as the outliers for those really quickly. These products have you covered.